Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends, and one should say fellow explorers of the psyche, I think that describes who we are. It's a pleasure to speak to you. The personal shadow constellates a practical and moral problem in the psychology of individuals. In the world of collective consciousness, the phenomenon of collective shadow projection poses moral, ethical, and practical problems for mankind as a whole. Indeed, failure to understand and contain collective shadows could unleash forces that would annihilate the civilized world, if not disrupt, in the worst case, the delicate biological balance of the planet. And I commend the organizers of this Congress for choosing such an urgent and important theme. Collective shadows may arise between national, ethnic, tribal, or other groups, or even cause splits within existing collectives, as is clearly evident in the history of all major religions. I was slightly too young to see military service in World War II, but I remember vividly the shifting images of collective shadows during and after that conflict. And I recall my confusion after the end of the war, when the stereotypes began to change. It was a shock to me to learn that the wartime Stalin, good old Uncle Joe in the stereotypes, had been responsible for liquidation of the kulak class of peasants in Russia. My first psychoanalyst, Bingham Dye, was not Jungian, but was trained by Harry Stack Sullivan in what is known in the United States as the cultural school of psychoanalysis. Dr. Dye was a Chinese sociologist before becoming an American psychotherapist, so that he had a wide opportunity to observe the dreams of different cultures. One of the most memorable things he taught me was that in his experience, the shadow in the dreams of the Chinese was often represented by the Japanese, while the shadow in Japanese dreams was represented by the Chinese, a very nice symmetry. Though I have had less cross-cultural experience, I can confirm, as I'm sure we all can, that racial and cultural stereotypes may appear in dreams as a representation of the shadow. This observation suggests linkage between the personal shadow and stereotypes of the collective shadow. The personal sphere of the psyche, the ego and the shadow, can be considered identity structures, while the anima animus and the persona can be thought of as relational structures, because they interface between the personal part of the psyche and, respectively, the collective unconscious within and collective consciousness outside. This is shown in slide 1. Uh-oh. This is allegedly shown in slide 1. Sabotage.
This is forward.
If you would go in the other direction.
This is my sensation function, my inferior sensation function. That's it. Back. That's it. I had it upside down. The right and left were reversed. This is slide 1, where the ego and shadow are contained within what could be called the personal sphere of the psyche, while the persona and anima animus form the boundaries of this personal sphere. Some complexes and their attendant identity structures are dissociated into the shadow in the course of early development. Any complex may have both positive or negative forms as seen from the point of view of a particular ego identity. A child's natural assertiveness, for example, may be dissociated into the shadow because that particular family equates assertiveness with unacceptable aggressiveness. Such a child may reach physical maturity without easy access to needed assertiveness because it is assigned to the shadow, while its opposite, passivity, may be over-integrated into the structure of both the child's ego and persona. While the existence of a shadow is a normal part of human personality, the specific contents of the shadow arise in this contextual fashion, dependent upon variables in early environment and experience, including, as Martine Gallard showed, the white shadow or void of hidden family secrets. The reworking of the contents of the shadow is the major part of most psychotherapeutic activity. In its formation, then, the shadow is only a preliminary integration. It allows the developing ego to achieve only a relative stability, which is necessary for a later and more complete integration of the opposites that were originally split between ego persona and shadow. This later, more complete integration focuses upon the unification of opposites and the archetypal image of conjunctio. This deeper integration requires a reliable ego and an adequate analytical vase or temenos, and it necessitates the moral courage necessary to face the dark shadow side of oneself, one's parents, one's family, one's culture. Although the presence of a content in the shadow, rather than in other structures of the psyche, does not imply an actual negative form from the viewpoint of the present ego, it does imply that the content was originally assigned to the shadow under the tension of a field of what might be called moral differentiation. This original field of moral tension, which may have been childish, premature, or incongruent with more adult standards, but this does not subtract from its moral tone. This is perhaps what Andrew Samuels called original morality. Later in our discussion, I wish to suggest where this field arises in one structural form of the archetype of the self. Collective shadow projections may have been responsible for many early reports of cannibalism, surprisingly, according to some recent anthropological speculation. In 1979, Ahrens reported, quote, "It is always their enemies or strangers or other more primitive peoples who are said to eat human flesh," end of quote. When he worked among the Lugara of Uganda, the tribe had to redefine him as, quote, "one of those rare Europeans who do not eat African babies," end of quote. Complexes are natural building blocks of the psyche. Our usual structural terms for the personal psyche, ego, persona, anima, animus, shadow, designate relatively enduring structures of complexes and a relatively stable identification of the ego with certain of these structures. The moral tension between ego, persona, and shadow, however, as well as the sex role tension between these three structures and the contrasexual anima animus, suggests that these structures occur in forms with at least two poles. This bipolarity, as reflected in the shadow, was emphasized in Dr. Sandner's paper. A bipolar structure of complexes, as for example the ego-shadow relationship, offers two poles with which the ego can identify. Its usual ego image or the shadow of that usual ego image. The shadow pole of the bipolar structure is, of course, often projected onto another person in the environment. This is convenient. It makes the shadow easy to identify. One looks for a person of the same sex whom one simply does not like for very good and justifiable reasons. Most of us, I assume, have not found a deficiency of such persons in the world. At least I have not. An intermediate stage between individual and collective psychology may be observed in the interaction of small 8 to 12 person psychotherapy groups. Jung distrusted group psychotherapy, but Bion, a pioneer in group psychotherapy, stated somewhat similar concern, noting that psychotherapy groups, in order to avoid their official conscious goal of work, tend to move between three different cultures of basic assumptions as to their purpose. These three basic assumption cultures were fight, flight, dependency, and pairing, collective attitudes. My own experience of psychotherapy groups, as well as that of some other Jungian analysts, has been quite positive, although most of my patients who are in group psychotherapy are concurrently in individual analysis as well. In my own experience, psychotherapy groups are supportive of individual differences, aiding their members to find personal expression rather than conformity. Therapy groups are a distinct aid in the individuation process of their members. They have in fact seemed to be a form of what Michael Polanyi called a society of explorers, where each person, as well as the society, is devoted to exploration of the deeper nature of reality. Needless to say, the reality explored includes the shadow, personal and collective. Why is it that psychotherapy groups, at least in my experience, are a collective that furthers individuation, while the collective in general is only the context for individuation or may actually work against it? One obvious answer is size. A psychotherapy group seldom exceeds a maximum of 12, and the traditional size was 8. And there may be some archetypal significance in those numbers, I don't know. But in functional terms, the psychotherapy group has something that most larger cultural collectives lack: a container, a boundary, a vase, a temenos. Without the secure and safe boundary, individuals often function, as Jung observed, with less consciousness than they are capable of in private. I would add that even if individual consciousness is maintained, in a collective situation, the individual may act as if he or she is unconscious. This is parallel to the phenomenon in group therapy, where something may be known consciously to each individual in the group, but because it has not been spoken of, is treated as if it is unconscious in the group process. While our clinical experience is largely with phenomena of the personal shadow, our world is particularly threatened by collective shadow projections. Reinhold Niebuhr, the American theologian, expressed a similar concern for the absence of moral judgment in collective groups in his well-titled book, Moral Man and Immoral Society. Whereas our Western Christian heritage has established guilt and redemption as modalities for the transformation of an individual's consciousness, there are no such established categories for collective consciousness. The concept of reparations is an attempt toward such a form, as is the current American legal concept euphemistically called affirmative action, having a hiring quota for minority groups to redress discriminatory inequalities of the past. Clearly, such collective attempts at restitution and repair may be unfair to particular individuals. In most instances, neither those who receive the restitution nor those who give it are the actual persons who were injured or did injury. Reverse discrimination to atone for past discriminations constitutes a tacit commitment to a principle of collective discrimination that is opposed to the judgment of individuals on their own unique merits. I think Charles Taylor's paper had relevance here, but I will not go into that. Collective guilt, based upon judgments of historical guilt, is psychologically similar to the unearned guilt that a neurotic individual suffers. It also contains an innate tendency to engender reaction formation and so perpetuate a cycle of collective inflation and deflation over an extended period of time. Politically sponsored terrorism against individuals who only represent collective groups is a recent example. Other historical examples come readily to mind. It is not important here to discuss the pros and cons of collective rituals of restitution, but merely to suggest that, like most collective concepts, they ride roughly over individual persons, that insignificant part of humanity upon which depend all the superstructures of culture and even biological survival. The individual may seem to be only an insignificant unit in the collective world, but seen subjectively, from inside, each person constitutes a unique universe. This is perhaps the most valuable component of our Jungian heritage. The existence of excessive collective shadows represents for the collective, as for the personal, a state of having attained only preliminary integration. Like the individual shadow, the shadow of a collective group represents unintegrated aspects of the collective and may be seen, like the personal shadow, as both dangerous and alluring. The modern history of blacks in America might serve as an example. My early childhood was in the eastern part of Texas prior to World War II. My grandmother called blacks by other less neutral names, and there were separate restaurants, drinking fountains, and toilet facilities for blacks and whites. At that time, the black persons carried the shadow of the white WASP community as being lazy, intellectually inferior, but also possessing a childlike and desirable joy in living and having none of the white society's conflicts about sexual expression. That has all changed. Blacks now are largely judged as individuals, and as a group are considered just as neurotic, unhappy, and sexually conflicted as everyone else. And the sexuality that had been lodged in the black collective shadow has perhaps been over-integrated into the culture with attendant benefits and disabilities. All this major change in public attitude has taken place rapidly in historical terms and with relatively little overt conflict, giving one hope for other integrations. But note that the integration of blacks into American society took place within a stable container, a structure which officially favored the integration. It is precisely the lack of such a container that constitutes a major danger in the actions of collective shadows in the current world. The terms in which the collective shadow appears are similar then to the terms of the personal shadow. The two principal similarities are, first, continuing pressure toward integration of the shadow, coupled with, second, a tendency to subvert true integration of the shadow into a preliminary, premature, incomplete, partial integration. This premature integration involves a splitting of contents into positive and negative opposites. The negative opposite belongs to them, the positive naturally to us, whoever we happen to be at that time. Collective shadows, like personal ones, arise in the field of moral differentiation, involving judgments of what is good and desirable and what is not. There are two major problems associated with the collective shadows of the present world. The first, already discussed, is the problem of shadow projection from one cultural group upon another, but complicated by the absence of a conscious world container for the integration of such collective shadows. The second problem, which I will discuss later, is best articulated by Michael Polanyi's concept of dynamo-objective coupling, quite a mouthful, which he earlier called moral inversion. Both problems touch upon Jung's concern with the shadow in the model of the archetypal self, which he presents in Ion. When groups become large enough, as in the present era of nation-states, the container must be still larger, a world culture which is still in the embryo stage of development. The archetype of the anthropos, which Jung presents in Ion, is an image of a higher form of mankind. I would suggest a collective term that would be equivalent to the anthropos for the collective, of the humanum, a sense of the unity and destiny of humanity as a unit, as a whole, as one world. In contrast to the present early and fragmented beginnings of the humanum, science is already universal, being based upon the unavoidable unity of the physical universe. But science achieves this unity across the boundaries of nation-states only by paying a substantial price. Science intentionally excludes the moral tensions that are part of the innate mechanism for the establishment of consciousness, as is shown in the phenomenology of the shadow. This preliminary integration in terms of moral differentiation, which produces the shadow, is precursor, as I have said, to a more complete integration involving the archetype of conjunctio. On the physical plane, the unity of science foreshadows the potential unity of the humanum on the plane of world culture. The personal shadow constellates a problem of moral courage for the individual, who must confront his or her own shadow in the innate process of individuation, a confrontation that may take place consciously with the help of the ego's moral courage, or unconsciously if the ego attempts to sidestep the problem of shadow integration. While the integrity of the personal sphere of the individual, as represented in this diagram, constitutes a container to withstand the pressure of shadow integration, there is no such ready-made container for the integration of most larger collective shadows. The personal sphere is a natural container for the individual, while the collective is yet in the process of constructing such a container for the integration of collective shadows. In a very profound sense, the problem of our present world is to find a container for the integration of collective shadows while there is still a world to integrate. In a physical sense, the container for collective shadows is the physical boundary of the planet Earth, already unified in the studies of science. The Earth is not an absolute container, for technological escape from the Earth is a possibility, at least for a seed of humanity. But in practical terms, the Earth is a spaceship and must sustain itself and its inhabitants, and requires the integration of collective shadows for its continued existence. There is no established world culture at present, although we need the images of shared collective value that a coherent world culture could bring. At present, there are competing images of world unity, and the crucial difference between them may well be the place of individual initiative and freedom. In psychological terms, the freedom for individuation. The humanum is an appropriate term to represent the collective sphere. In the collective sphere, the concept of what individuation requires in the individual psyche. The image of God might be a link between the external collective and the objective psyche within, informing the humanum collectively and constituting an imago Dei of the archetypal self. The archetypal self is clearly concerned with the unification of opposites, which may be seen frequently in dreams. As I've mentioned, the current lack of a reliable and sufficient world container for the integration of collective shadows is a pressing problem. Let us now relate the field of moral tension in which both individual and collective shadows arise to Jung's three-dimensional model of the archetypal self, discussed in his essay, The Structure and Dynamics of the Self, in the concluding section of Ion. To clearly distinguish Jung's diagrammatic representation of the self from his other more discursive presentations, I will refer to this model as the ionic self. The image of a transcending higher collective unity, the humanum, is related to an archetypal image of humanity or higher man, the anthropos, which Jung places in a crucial position in his hierarchical model of the self in Ion. Now, I made these slides because this is awfully hard to follow sometimes without some representation. With deference to Michael Fordham, I propose to call Jung's hierarchical model of the archetypal self, which this slide represents, the de-integrate form of the self, to distinguish it clearly from the non-hierarchical form that Jung labels as the self in Euroboric form. Many tensions between the classical school of Jungian theory and less emphasized variations, such as archetypal psychology, perhaps can be correlated with differing emphasis upon these two forms of the archetypal self. This de-integrate form of the archetypal self has certain obvious characteristics. I will call your attention to only a few. First, it is based upon the model of the cross-cousin marriage, which can be seen clearly in the double pyramid that Jung labeled both the Moses quaternio and also called the Anthropos quaternio. Here. He called it the Moses quaternio because he used part of the story of Moses to illustrate its structure. From the ego standpoint of the ordinary man, which would be the lower Adam, I can't tell if this is in focus. Would you please tell me if it's not? The lower Adam, situated at the lower apex of these two double pyramids, Moses appears as a culture hero. To this identity of ordinary man, or homo, Moses is also the father. Zipporah, the wife of Moses, is the daughter of a king and Midianite priest, Jethro, called the Great Wise One. From this same viewpoint of lower Adam, or homo, Zipporah is the higher mother. Thus, from this identity of lower Adam, Moses and Zipporah together represent the royal pair that Jung discusses in The Psychology of the Transference, in that very important essay and diagram. But the ego may also be identified with the figure of Moses. From the identity of Moses, Jethro is the higher man, but on the same plane, and his sister Anima is Miriam. And it would seem to me that Moses' wife, Zipporah, concerns perhaps conjunctio at that horizontal level. Jethro, as the father of Zipporah and higher man to Moses, as well as Miriam as Anima's sister, introduce the incest tensions that are an innate part of the marriage quaternio. This situation is complicated in the story when Moses marries the Ethiopian woman, the Cushite, who is apparently unacceptable, at least partially, because she falls into the collective shadow projected onto a different ethnic and cultural group. From this part of the Moses material, Jung develops the shadow quaternio, in which Moses appears as carnal man. Jethro becomes a heathen priest who did not serve Yahweh and did not belong to the chosen people, but departs from them into his own country, in Exodus 18:27. Zipporah is replaced by the shadowy Ethiopian woman. In response to this situation, Miriam becomes leprous and speaks against Moses. These altered shadow relationships are shown in the slide that you're looking at. Now, Jung's exposition, as you all know, is quite complicated and extends downward below the shadow quaternio to the paradise quaternio, and even lower into the lapis quaternio, which are not part of our discussion. The range that Jung attributes to the deintegrate self extends then from the inorganic world of the lapis quaternio with its nadir in the rotundum, and that may relate to the atomic world, to the zenith above mankind, symbolized by the anthropos. Jung describes the serpens as the point of maximum tension in this chain of four double pyramids. The serpens compresses within itself the extreme opposites of Christ and the devil, Christus Diabolus. Here, the maximum tension at the midpoint. There is not time to explore the whole range of implication of Jung's thought in regard to this model of the deintegrate self, but several observations are pertinent to our discussion of collective shadows. First, it is clear that ego identity, as in a fairy tale, can be assigned to various figures within the structure of the deintegrate self. To Moses, or to the lower Adam, for example, in Jung's discussion of the anthropos quaternio. Thus, the deintegrate patterns of the self may serve as models of ego identity, and the structural relationships of the figures vary according to whether the ego is identified with one or another of what might be called archetypal complexes within the structure of the self. Secondly, it is not simply the ego of Moses that falls into the shadow identity, symbolized by his marriage to the Ethiopian woman. Rather, the entire quaternio of relationships falls into the shadow state. Third, in the deintegrate form of the archetypal self, there are clear possibilities for movement, quote, upward toward the higher goal of the anthropos, and corresponding dangers of falling, quote, downward in a regressive direction toward the subpersonal paradise and lapis quaternios. In fact, it would not be too much to say that the field of moral tension in which the personal shadow arises can be seen in this diagram as based upon the structure of the deintegrate form of the archetypal self. But Jung does not stop at this point in his description of the self, but asks how the situation would look if higher and lower were collapsed, if the rotundum and the anthropos were placed side by side. This configuration Jung clearly labels as, quote, the arrangement in the Ouroboros, end of quote, justifying the convenience of calling it the Euroboric form of the archetypal self, in distinction to the deintegrate form. Although this image retains the greater tension between the anthropos rotundum and the serpens, as compared to the lesser tension between homo and lapis, it is clear that the hierarchical stresses and the tension implicit in the serpens have been greatly lessened. Jung clearly states that the quaternio structures he has chosen were for explanatory purposes only and could be replaced with other examples. He intended to emphasize the underlying structure, which he does even more dramatically by showing the quaternio series of double pyramids in the form of an equation that emphasizes the innate dynamic processes of the self. I'm so glad it's not upside down or backwards. The large A, B, C, and D are analogous to the double pyramid structures. And the smaller A, B, C, and D are an enantiodromic movement in a sense, because they seem to rotate toward the left, while the larger figures rotate toward the right. And one must remember that when one goes from a large A, B, C, D back to large A again, Jung points out that it is at a different level. It returns to its beginning, but at a higher level, through a process involving enantiodromia. It is equivalent to a rotating mandala image. I would suggest that the Euroboric form of the archetypal self is analogous to the center of the mandala, that which is symbolically circumambulated but never reached, while the pathways of the deintegrate form of the self are the processes of circumambulation of that center in the time-bound world. It would appear from the equation model of the self that this circumambulation is sometimes experienced in a movement of enantiodromia, the little movements on the corners, that only seems to move against the larger spiral process that actually has as its goal the continual achievement of a, quote, higher plane. These forms of the archetypal self, deintegrate and Euroboric, would appear to be complementary. Emphasis on the deintegrate form constellates the moral tensions that are innate in the empirical personality and its development, with the attendant problems of personal and collective shadows. But an emphasis on the Euroboric form tends to collapse, but not quite, the moral tension and makes all gods relatively equal. It is no stretch of the imagination, at least the Jungian imagination, to see in these two forms of the archetypal self some analogs to tensions in the collective discussion of Jung's work, particularly as Samuels explained that. I wish to draw from this brief discussion of Jung's ionic self one major conclusion. Jung's model of the deintegrate form of the archetypal self includes an inevitable moral tension in both individual and group shadows. And I wish to conclude the paper with a brief presentation of the unique collective shadow problem of the modern world, what Michael Polanyi called moral inversion, and more formally described as dynamo-objective coupling. Michael Polanyi was a post-critical philosopher of science, a fellow of the Royal Society for Work in Physical Chemistry, who grew up in Budapest only a few years earlier than Yolanda Jacobi. My Zurich thesis was based on applying his epistemology to the problem of the dream ego and the waking ego, and I have found his work fruitful in other ways as well. One of Polanyi's most psychologically insightful discoveries was his clear elucidation of what he originally called moral inversion and later discussed as dynamo-objective coupling. A question that greatly concerned Polanyi was the manner in which many Western democratic intellectuals were attracted to Marxism in the early decades of this century. Another lesser concern was the untestable nature of Freudian psychoanalysis, despite its claim to scientific status. Both Marxism and psychoanalysis were allegedly based upon scientific principles, and yet among many of their followers, each had the quality of a religion, whose basic assumptions, unlike the tenets of science, were insulated from falsifiability. From these speculations, Polanyi came to understand the psychological structure of what he called dynamo-objective coupling. The dynamo-objective coupling is a linkage in which a system of beliefs that are consciously and overtly held for allegedly objective reasons are actually and covertly held because of strong moral commitment. Such a dynamo-objective is very difficult to change. And why is this so? If attacked on moral grounds, the dynamo-objective coupling is defended as being objective and, like science, having nothing whatsoever to do with morality. If attacked on grounds of its supposed objective nature, the dynamo-objective coupling is defended with moral fervor, although the moral basis is simultaneously denied. Thus, if one pole of the dynamo-objective coupling is attacked, it is defended from the other pole. This produces an extremely stable structure, but one that is not open to ordinary forms of evidence and persuasion. I've discussed elsewhere how this structure of dynamo-objective coupling underlies the structure of neurotic defenses. In that context, I referred to the dynamo-objective coupling as an attitude of pseudo-objectivity. Polanyi describes an innate moral commitment in the human mind, one that is present even in scientific investigation, although it is inconsistent with the official collective view of the dispassionate nature of science. Jung postulates a similar innate moral tension in humanity, as illustrated in our previous discussion of how personal and collective shadows are grounded in the deintegrate form of the archetypal self. A dynamo-objective coupling occurs when the moral nature of one's position is consciously denied while continuing to be expressed unconsciously. This was Polanyi's answer to why so many intellectuals in democratic countries were attracted to Marxism. Through an over-identification with the official objectivity of science, they had lost the sense of grounding for their moral values. Their innate need for moral differentiation was denied and remained unsatisfied. The dynamo-objective coupling structure of Marxism and early Freudian psychoanalytic theory permitted an unconscious pseudo-solution for the non-integration of scientific values of objectivity and religious values of meaning, while continuing to consciously deny that they were working on moral assumptions, and while proclaiming their service to a supposedly objective process. These people had free rein to express moral judgments while denying that they were doing so. Thus, through a form of neurotic compromise, they fulfilled the proverbial state of having one's cake and eating it too, or perhaps eating someone else's cake would be more precise. Lithuanian cake, Latvian cake, Estonian cake, for example. Religious persecutions of the past at least had an overt moral basis, even if mistaken in application. Much of the Middle East conflict has this form, with mutual shadow projections among collective groups. This represents the classic form of the collective shadow. Given a sufficient collective container for the values of a humanum, such conflicts are resolvable in the name of universally applied moral principles, a resolution denied by the existence of collective dynamo-objective couplings. Albert Camus, in his book The Rebel, made an important distinction between rebellion and revolution. Both are resistances to oppression. But in revolution, the power struggle to overthrow an oppressor often miscarries because the successful revolutionary becomes the new oppressor, simply taking the place of his former foe without any change in the underlying power structures. Camus defined rebellion, however, as a resistance to an oppressor in the name of common human values that embrace both the rebel and the oppressor. Revolution has a tendency to continue divisions. Rebellion carries the potential of healing. These are crucial differences in the current world. I suggest that what Camus called revolution is based upon a dynamo-objective coupling that inhibits it from realizing the unconscious moral principles that are its actual motive force. In Camus' description of rebellion, the moral claims are conscious and therefore realizable in the collective world. The presence in the modern world of collective ideologies that appear to be based upon the structure of dynamo-objective coupling, something hitherto unknown in the world, constitutes this second and more serious difficulty in the resolution of collective shadows today. Undoing the moral inversion of a dynamo-objective coupling is equivalent to the treatment of collective neurosis. I do not at this moment know where we will find an analytic couch of sufficient dimension for that purpose. In closing this paper on the persistence of collective shadows, I could do no better than quote Jung's concluding sentence from The Undiscovered Self. I am neither spurred on by excessive optimism nor in love with high ideals, but am merely concerned with the fate of the individual human being, that infinitesimal unit on whom a world depends, and in whom, if we read the meaning of the Christian message aright, even God seeks his goal. Thank you.
My dear colleague from Dallas, your presentation and your thoughts reached me in Paris at a time when I'd just returned from Scotland. I'd been on holiday, I'd been in the extreme north, and I'd been looking at the old Pictic settlements and the runic inscriptions on stones that have been stood pointing towards the sky. I returned from a country of Celtic myth, impressed by the expression of light and shadow, of a mythical nature in that country. I slowly translated your work, consulting Jung, Camus and others. At the time I was in the Provence, at the foot of the Cevennes, a place where the sky is constantly replaced and renewed, in a place of a Mediterranean civilization with all its mythologies, but also in the Provence with its bloody religious wars between Catholics and Protestants, the trace of which can be seen in architecture and in the collective memory, and also, even today, in political thought. Those are the propitious circumstances under which I read your text and was interested in it, and being a lower Adam, being man in revolt as I could be, someone who, as all of us, is constantly confronted with the shadow, being also a Jungian analyst for 10 months in the year, someone who in transfer and in counter-transfer sees the shadow of others and his own, almost like a coal miner, a careful one, always running the risk of a fire-damp explosion, an explosion caused by fascination with the ego. Jung, in Psychological Healing, puts forward a definition of the shadow. I quote, "The shadow is a hidden, repressed personality. Often it's an inferior one, overladen with guilt. The most extreme ramifications of it go right back to the realm of our animal ancestors. It covers all the historic aspect of the unconscious. If one were to say that the human shadow is the source of all evil, if now we look more closely, we can see that unconscious man, shadow in other words, is not only made up of morally reprehensible trends, but that it also incorporates a number of good qualities, normal instincts, it includes good qualities, normal instincts, appropriate reactions, realistic views of things, and creative drives." I read with a great deal of interest the theoretical work that's been done by James Hall on the structures of collective shadows, and I myself felt involved in the implications. I read through Jung's work once again, and it was this definition that I've just quoted that guided my thoughts. At the same time, I was wondering, well, how should I react as discussant? Should I perhaps try and go even further into this theoretical work? I just didn't think I could do that. Should I perhaps criticise individual passages? Should I perhaps polemicise? I didn't want to do that either. Or should I perhaps give free rein to my thoughts in a spirit of, in a holistic spirit, and have a discussion of one clinical example that I'm familiar with, and in particular when Dr. James Hall tried to explain the projections of collective showers, I thought of a case of a pseudo-objectivity with a Marxist ideology and a Freudian psychoanalyst experiencing this in its most scientific form. That is what I decided to do. Now with me, I'd like you to listen in to the unconscious of Pascal. He's a Marxist, going through a struggle. I'll call him Ulysses, a modern Ulysses, and in a moment's time you'll see why I'm calling him Ulysses. He came to see me 10 years ago with his wife. Their marriage was on the rocks, and quite naively, they wanted to come to me and say, well, which of the two of them should undergo psychotherapy with me? In front of me, Pascal let such a fugue of guilt go over him that I decided to work with him, and I gave the address of a colleague of mine to his wife. After years, the couple split up officially. A whole lot of what I will call Freudian work had been done on his relationship, his virtually incestuous relationship with his mother and his sister, who was a few years older than him, and with whom he had lived more or less as a mollycoddled little man after his father had died when he was 12, right up to the point in time when he got married at the age of 25. There are three brief dreams that I'd like to talk about and show you how he came into contact with the shadow. The first of these dreams shows quite clearly, quite spectacularly, how he met a paternal archetype. The dream's as follows. He was in a hospital ward, and he was making fun of the patients, and then he saw the bottom of the feet of someone who just died. He was laughing at the dead patient and shrugging his shoulders, and a nurse came up to him and said, "Aren't you ashamed of yourself? It's Louis XIV who's just died." At that point, he ran off to hide in a hut in the woods. That was the dream in which he recognized that he was becoming aware of the importance of his father in his life. His father had been a taxi driver. In the dream, he became a king. What a king! The Sun King. In point of fact, his father took 4 years to die from a gastroenteral cancer between the period when the child was 8 or 12. He'd been to the school more or less on a regular basis during that period, and he spent a lot of time in the forest where he became a lone wolf type of child. He found a defense for the absence of the father, the degradation of the father's physical image by removing all value from him. In his dream, he recognized that this comic figure of the dead king went beyond the image of his father, and he became aware, painfully aware, of a paternal archetype which until then he'd neither wanted nor been able to recognize in himself as a dynamic value. When he'd been an orphan with neither father or mother, in essence, he'd really over-experienced the animal part, the child wolf part of his shadow. The second dream, and its association with social objective reality, shows the scenario of man in revolt who thought that a revolutionary ideology was an answer to his anguished question, seeing the rising shadow in himself. The dream is as follows. He's on the running board of an old-fashioned railway coach, calling on a number of comrades to jump on the train with him. It was a coach as part of a very, very long train, pulled by a steam locomotive decked out in red flags. The enthusiasm of this revolutionary train calmed down a bit as the train started moving. He was in the last coach and speaking with friends. Behind the coach, he suddenly heard an ear-splitting noise. He went to the door and looked out and saw that the last coach was being followed fast by a locomotive, which was also decked out in red flags, which was spitting out black smoke. Suddenly, in an instant, he realised that it was the same locomotive, that the train was on a circular track and had been going round in circles at increasing speeds. Without any hesitation, he jumped off the moving train and woke up breathing heavily. He told me in an early part of his therapy that he was a member of the Communist Party. In fact, he even brought a broadsheet which had been written by a group of communist Freudian psychoanalysts justifying psychoanalysis. He'd entered the Communist Party with a virtually religious fervour and had been guided by an old comrade from work, a generous man, full of vigour, and someone which had acted more or less like a surrogate father for him. He said that he taught him social language and that he taught him to read in a way that he hadn't beforehand. For over a year, I noticed that he'd stopped talking about his revolutionary ideology and that he seemed to be distancing himself from it. In this particular dream, the ideology, which is drawn on dynamically by the steam locomotive, suddenly becomes a destructive machine. Kronos eating his children, good old Uncle Joe, as the speaker put it. The interpretation of the dream was a painful, embarrassing one for him. For several months, he was mourning this ideology which had helped him to become integrated in social life, which he'd shared with friends, this ideal of heaven on earth to come. But in the same way, he'd projected his individual shadow as part of an unconscious general shadow. I had sympathy with him, and I waited patiently for him to avoid the possible splintering as a result of this work on the integration of his personal shadow. Goodbye, comrade Pascal. Enter Ulysses. Yes, Ulysses. Ulysses the eternal, the universal Ulysses that's in each one of us. This particular Ulysses is, for him, had taken a concrete form of a sailing boat, 7 meters long, that he'd been building every weekend for several years. He'd been trained in sailing and learnt to navigate in the Atlantic. He'd even imposed holidays on the Atlantic, on his family and his wife and children. He had copper-coloured hair and a Flemish background. He looked a bit like a Viking. Since he'd been divorced, since he'd distanced himself, since he'd jumped off the moving train of revolution, he himself had started building an even bigger boat, a 10-metre one with a metal hull. And in 6 or 7 years' time, when his children were grown up and he'd finished his analysis, he wanted to sail round the world alone. This was a new ideal aim in life that he'd set up for himself. Once again, he'd become in the grasp of a fascination of a false ego. His dreams focused on sunk boats which had been rusted and turned over, broken in part by tidal waves. Then he had the following dream, I quote, "I went to the quay where my boat ought to be, and it wasn't there. There was a ring where I knew I'd tied it up. I looked into the water. Just in the bottom of the water, I could see that my boat had sunk. The water was very dark. The boat was sitting on the seabed, but it seemed to be intact. From the bow, I saw a thin rope, like a thread, which rose to the surface. I followed it. I picked it up at the surface, and then I followed it. It was like Ariadne's thread. I came to the front of a building on the quayside. The thread went up the wall to a small door, behind which there was a little niche which had been built into the wall. The door was made of a precious wood, elaborately engraved in the shape of a circular rosace, as you would find on a cathedral. At the end of the thread there was a very fine key. It was gold-plated, or perhaps even solid gold. I gathered together. I knew what I was doing, but I didn't dare touch that key because there was as it were, a tabernacle behind it where I'd find a sacred object. I was certain that this object, which was tied to my boat, which was sunk but intact, would, when the time came, enable me to refloat my boat. That's the end of the dream. Now, I wonder, he himself called this thread Ariadne's thread for this Ulysses who'd taken the Icarus out of his idealized boat. If the link between the boat, which was sunk in his shadow of his great ego, is this not the most authentic expression of his ego in a sacred and Mandalian representation? What happened to Ulysses on his long travels? For between the age of 8 and 12, he'd been abandoned by his father who was dying and his mother who dealt with her ailing husband. During that period of time, he'd seen his shadow in the most animal part of himself. He'd gone to the forests to be by himself. He would lie in the grass and live more or less like the lizard's tail of our personal shadow. After his father had died, he came back into the fold. He rejected that particular aspect of himself, the animal aspect. He started studying again and learnt what normal civilized man learns from formal education. A few years later, the surrogate father, someone he had admired, brought him into the collective of an ideology which offered a space for him in which he could create his structure, and he had then integrated his shadow in the shadow of the collective, hoping to find a way towards the light. Later on, when he built his first boat, he thought that for him himself and his family, he'd found a sufficient support so that he could also move towards enchanting horizons. When everything fell apart, he left his family. Again, he wanted to find a hideout in a small, dirty flat where, at the time he started his therapy. It was only after several years when he met the father Archetype that beyond the certain dream, he was able to disintegrate his shadow from the collective shadow. That was necessary for him, but even that was not enough. The idea of it was necessary for him to become aware, to create his own proper shadow. And the last dream shows that in a representation of the shadow, the boat representing the superego, in a direct representation with an ego which he still had to discover, linked by the thread from nigrido to albedo. The route is a long one. But Ulysses can return to himself, can come back home. His Penelope Anima is waiting for him to continue the weaving.
I'd love to, first of all, say how good it was to hear a talk in language that I have learned and entirely understand. It was rather like coming home. And now we can get on to perhaps a little bit of old-fashioned scholastic Jungian theology. And I wonder, James, if you would comment on my impression that I'm becoming a little bit heretical now and wondering if the shadow can't sometimes be of the opposite sex, because my impression is that one doesn't get to know one's shadow until one is in a long live-in relationship with somebody of the opposite sex, and it seems to me now that in people's dreams that also happens. Could you comment on that?
Of course, I would never think that any of these structures of the psyche occur in libido-tight compartments. And one, particularly in watching dream images, finds places where they flow together and separate. In my own mind, I think of the basic structure of the psyche as complexes, and with the classic idea that there's an archetypal core to each complex moving around, and that the thing that is most interesting is the way that the psyche is autonomous and is capable of, on its own, at least as one can see in dreams, sometimes changing in a subtle way the identity of the ego, or in a different way the activity of the dream ego has a real effect on the structure of the psyche, in the same manner that the waking ego clearly has an effect on the structure of the psyche. And these concepts of persona, anima, animus, shadow, and so forth, describe large territories of many complexes that are coordinated in a rough way. So clinically, it would not trouble me at all to find shadow aspects in a contrasexual figure.
I may have misheard or misinterpreted your paper, Dr. Hall, but I understand you to be saying that the only real hope for collective survival is in the cultivation of that consciousness that attaches to the consciousness of the anthropos. And where Jung deals with this, he's usually describing a very sophisticated form of consciousness that has an esoteric religiosity attached to it. For instance, he'll speak of the whole man, the Adam Cadman, the Pauline Christ, and perhaps this could be extended to the young Marx. And because this is such a highly developed state of consciousness that could easily be related to the consciousness of the unus mundus, I wonder how hopeful you are that this consciousness could be so universally cultivated that in effect it would be a survival mode.
Like Jung, I understand that what is most likely to save us, if anything can, is that enough individuals develop consciousness and hold the tensions of opposites, including collective opposites, within themselves. Now, I think of that somewhat in the same way I think of the drug Dilantin in epilepsy. That Dilantin doesn't keep the abnormal focus that causes the epileptic discharge from being active. It keeps it from being propagated through normal cells. And if there are enough individuals in a culture or in a society that are not easily swept into collective movements, I think that would dampen some of the convulsive possibilities. Now, what I am personally concerned with at the moment is what will happen because of the archetypal constellation of the year 2000 that catches projections whether we want it to or not. Even the turn of the speedometer on centuries catches a lot, and on 1,000 years it will catch even more. And so I think the next 14 years are going to be fairly crucial in what happens in the world. And I'm somewhat hopeful. The big split, collectively speaking, is between science and religion. Science representing our most advanced idea of what is real, but remember what is real beneath the human level, looking at the substrate of the human mind. And what has traditionally carried the values as opposed to what is real, the question of what is valuable, has been religion. And religion is so fragmented and goes in so many different directions, and all that is complicated by this dynamo-objective coupling, which is built into some very powerful political systems. I think we simply do what we can do, but being Jungians, we are in a particularly valuable position in this discussion because Jung's work touches very deeply on both science and religion, but from a point of view that is not the usual point of view of either one of those major collective activities. Question. Dream that I came across of that sort was a man who was in the train station in Philadelphia in the dream, desperately trying to find someone who could tell him which train to take to Philadelphia, meaning that he was already where he was trying to go if he would simply stop and realize that. And then I remember a person having an LSD experience describing that he looked around a corner in a house and saw a dragon's tail disappearing. So he rushed over to that next room, and then he saw it disappearing here, and he finally realized that it would have to be his tail if he saw it around every corner. Don't chase your own tail.